This is big picture anatomy with a view of how the spinal cord, together with the spinal nerve, forms all the components of a spinal cord reflex. So let's start and see what we've got here. First of all, the view of our vertebra in cross-section, where we can see the vertebral body and the vertebral arch with the spinal cord in place, cut in cross-section or transverse section. Remember, as if we laid the person flat, face down on the table, cut right across their trunk, and pulled the vertebra and the spinal cord out of there. And then what we've done is amplified or magnified up that spinal cord so that we can see it now, large size, with all the components of the spinal nerve coming off of it. What we've got then, blown up to large size, is the spinal cord itself. By the way, we're no longer drawing it in blue because for the rest of the diagram, our key is that the sensory components or neurons are in red and the blue is in motor, and so we don't want to get that confused with that embryonic origin ectoderm of the spinal cord. From down here, sensory is all in red, motor is in blue. We've got the spinal cord itself with its gray matter, its butterfly of gray matter drawn out in the middle with the dorsal horn on either side and the ventral horn on either side, surrounded by the white matter, and then the roots of that spinal nerve, the ventral root and the dorsal root of the spinal nerve coming together to form the spinal nerve itself. Now let's take a look at the components of that spinal cord reflex, or the neurons that actually come off the spinal cord, sensory and motor neurons. Remember, if we're going to have a spinal cord reflex, we're going to have an insult like a burn or a poke to our finger here. That's going to send an impulse down the sensory neurons to the spinal cord itself. The cell body of those sensory neurons are going to be located in the dorsal root ganglion. The sensory neurons all pass through the dorsal root and onto the dorsal horn of the spinal cord, where they then create a cascade of interneurons, which I've just drawn in green here, that will trigger a motor neuron response. The motor neuron, drawn in blue, an example of a motor neuron, will leave from the ventral horn of the spinal cord through the ventral root of the spinal nerve and go out to a muscle, creating a contraction in that muscle. Remember, these are just individual sample neurons. There, of course, would be a number of different neurons involved in any reflexive response. A few details on the neurons themselves. The sensory neuron, we can also call the afferent neuron because it takes that impulse towards, or I like to say A for at, the spinal cord. And the motor neuron, we sometimes call the efferent neuron because it has its impulse exiting the spinal cord, E for exiting, and it brings that impulse to the muscle cells. The neurons are surrounded, the axons of the neurons are surrounded by these cells that wrap them called Schwann cells. They almost look like hot dog buns surrounding the axon going down the middle, and they're grouped along the axon or repeated along the axon like this. And those Schwann cells are full of a fatty substance called myelin. That's why you often draw them in yellow, because they actually do appear somewhat yellow in life and give the entire axon and the bundle of axons a shiny, whitish, yellowish appearance. So just to recap what we're looking at, a schematic view of a spinal cord reflex shown in the form of the components of a spinal nerve leaving the spinal cord. Remember, we would start with a burn or a sharp input to a sensory neuron, indicated in red, that would carry an afferent impulse to the spinal cord, to the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. The cell body of that sensory neuron would be in the dorsal root ganglion. A cascade of interneurons would trigger a processing response in motor neurons, a single motor neuron represented here leaving through the ventral root and carrying that impulse to the muscle cells, where it would affect a movement reaction or cause the finger to be withdrawn from wherever it's at. The spinal cord itself would be situated inside the vertebral foramen of a vertebra, as indicated here. That then is how the spinal cord with the spinal nerve, components of the spinal cord nerve leaving it, create a spinal cord reflex from big picture anatomy.